Hey y'all, what is up? Keasbey here, and today we're going to be talking about my new and improved Floowandereeze Deck Profile. But before we get into all that, don't forget to drop this video a like and subscribe to the channel for even more. As is tradition before any of my videos, let's get the preamble out of the way. First and foremost, this isn't our first rodeo talking about Floowandereeze, so a lot of stuff that I've covered in other videos I'm kind of going to skip over here, but please see the suggested reading list that is on screen right now if you are new to the deck and haven't been following along the whole time. Next thing, while previous deck profiles were much more going second based, this one is optimized to go first, but we do still have some concessions for if we do lose the die roll. And the last thing that I do want to mention, as with every profile, I do get questions about budget alternatives for some more expensive cards, and I am going to try to make an effort in this video to mention some replacements that you can try. There is one in the main deck that it's kind of hard to find a good replacement for, and then the extra deck stuff is just, it's extra deck and Floowandereeze. You could honestly replace it with almost anything that's remotely playable in the deck and be totally fine. Alright, so with all of that preamble out of the way, let's get right into the deck. First off, we're kicking it off with 3 copies of Floowandereeze and Rabina. She is our only pure 1-card starter in this deck, absolutely mandatory to be playing 3. Following that up, we're on triple copies of Floowandereeze and Eaglin. While this deck only has 1 pure 1-card starter, we do have a abundance of 2-card starters, and Eaglin, I think, sets those up the best. So we are on 3 of him, want access to this card at all times. Only thing to keep in mind is we only play 4 search targets for him, so just in grindier games, keep a mental note of if you have any left in the deck. Following that up, we are on 1 copy each of Floowandereeze and Stree and Floowandereeze and Toucan. Only 1 copy of each of these, as they don't really do anything to start our plays, and you don't necessarily need them turn 1 unless you are really overextending, in which case, awesome. That being said though, they do form a very powerful resource loop to keep your Floowandereeze in archetype cards alive at all times, so very important to be playing both of them, but 1 absolutely feels like enough. Next up, onto the big birds, we are on double copies of Floowandereeze and Empen. So I do want to talk really quick. First of all, have to mention, no part of Empen's effect has a once per turn attached to it. So summoning multiple Empens means multiple searches. Really cool. Next thing that I do want to mention, as I think people have kind of forgotten a little bit how this works unless they are directly playing Floowandereeze, is how Empen's Floodgate effect works. So Empen specifically says that monsters that were special summoned that are in attack position cannot activate their effects. This has no bearing on continuous effects or effects that don't activate. Additionally as well, Empen doesn't negate anything. So a really great way to illustrate this difference is Cherubini, Angel of the Burning Abyss. Cherubini, Angel of the Burning Abyss has an effect that dumps a monster from deck to graveyard, and then it gets an attack boost or something. I forget what the actual effect is on it, because the actual effect doesn't matter. It's just being able to pay that cost of activation that does count. So under something like Skill Drain, which is actively negating Cherubini, or even if Cherubini is hit with an impermanence, you can still dump that monster from deck to grave because it's an activation cost, and then just whatever Cherubini does on resolution, again, totally forget, just won't happen. Under Empen, however, Cherubini can't even dump that monster from the deck to the graveyard because that cost is part of the activation, and that activation is what Empen specifically stops. Following that up, we're on 1 copy of Rise of the Mega Monarch. Again, no part of Rise's effect is a once per turn, and the bonus effect to bounce a card from field back to the hand can self-target. Actually, all his effects can self-target, but you really do want to bounce Ryza back to the hand so you can summon him a second time during the turn, because again, no part of this effect is once per turn. Just a remarkably powerful card, plus can form a resource loop in and of himself by stacking a card from your own graveyard back on top of the deck during your opponent's turn so you immediately draw it during your turn, or if you have Unexplored Winds live and haven't resolved Pot of Prosperity, you can actually just immediately put something back on top of your deck from your graveyard with Ryza, and then once Ryza's back in your hand, spin Ryza to the bottom of the deck with Winds and draw whatever you put on top of the deck. Following that up, we're on 1 copy of Mist Valley Apex Avion. I think it's absolutely necessary. This card really does put in work once you force that simplified game state that this deck is shooting to do, and is just an overall remarkably powerful card. Alrighty, that does it for our birds. Let's get into hand traps. We're on triple copies of Dimension Shifter. Not a ton to say about this card that hasn't already been said, but I do think it is exceptionally strong right now in this format specifically. Even though there are some decks that are actually siding Dimension Shifter, a lot of those decks can only side Dimension Shifter because they're controlling when it activates. If you control when that Dimension Shifter activates, something like Pearly really has a lot of trouble playing through Dimension Shifter despite the fact that they side it regularly. Also worth mentioning that for the access code line that we very rarely use but have in the extra deck, spellcaster typing on Dimension Shifter, important to keep in mind. Following that up and closing out our monsters, we're on one copy of DD Crow. I like having the one copy of DD Crow in a main deck. It's a nice search off of Rubina if we don't really have anything to do with that search that we need. Plus, we can always search it on our opponent's turn as well. Only one copy in the main deck though, because again, it is searchable and we can always recycle it with Ryza if we feel the overwhelming urge to. Plus, side deck, we've got an additional one if we feel the need for it. All right, that does it for the monsters. Let's talk spells and traps. First off, we are on triple copies of Floowandereeze and the Magnificent map. So just because of the existence of SP Little Knight off of IP Masquerena or Nightmare Unicorn off of IP Masquerena or Guardian Chimera, it is really important to note that while both effects on Magnificent map are hard ones per turns, the ignition and the trigger effect, the actual activation of the card itself is not. So a lot of these special summon a monster on your opponent's turn, then that monster that was special summoned removes something from the field effects have to be used preemptively against something like map, otherwise they'll miss their opportunity to stop map from being able to resolve. So if they do that and preemptively remove map from the field and you have another copy of it in hand, provided again that you haven't used the effects, you can just slam down that second copy of map and then activate the effect afterwards. So this is a really big reason why we are also running one copy of Terraforming. The only thing that you really have to look out for in this is Droll and Lockbird completely shutting off your play after a Terraforming search. Following that up and still talking about map adjacent cards, we are running one copy of Gold Sarcophagus. So I really like Gold Sarcophagus as just kind of like a one-time use mini map basically. It turns all of our other small birds that aren't Rubina into one card starters. Additionally, later in the game, it can be used just to filter a card you don't necessarily want to draw out of your deck. It could set something up for Toucan to immediately recover, or worst case scenario in a very grindy game where you really need that Harpy's Feather Duster and your opponent isn't particularly putting you on a clock, you can wait out the 2 turns to get that Harpy's Feather Duster. After that, we are on triple copies of Floowandereeze and the Advent of Adventure. Not much more to say about this card beyond it truly does make this deck tick. There is really absolutely no replacement for it, and it's a budget card now, thankfully. So if this was what was holding you back from picking up this deck, absolutely go grab the Mega Tin copies now. Following that up, we are on one copy of Floowandereeze and the Unexplored Winds. Absolutely please check out the rulings videos. We talk about this card a lot in that, and there really is kind of a lot going on under the hood of this seemingly simple card. It really is the key to winning the mirror matches, plus it really does strengthen Ryza acting as a resource loop. Absolutely check out those ruling videos to learn so much more about this unbelievably cool card. Unfortunately, it doesn't really enable you to start plays. At best, you can try to mulligan a bad hand to get something playable, but I don't want to play multiple copies just to try to facilitate that. That does it for the Floowandereeze specific support. Let's get into the general spells. We're on triple copies of Pot of Prosperity. Not much more to say about this beyond just don't forget the half damage clause. I've forgotten it. I've seen other people forget it. I think it happens to all of us at least once. Following that up, we're on triple copies of Pot of Duality. It's basically half prosperity but free. Just remember, if you are in one of those weird situations where you might want to make a double Azaeus or something like that, duality does restrict you from special summoning for the turn that you activate it. Not going to come up particularly often, but always good to remember. Following that up, we are on the only 2 non-budget cards in the main deck, Triple Tactics Thrust. So there isn't really a solid replacement for this card for the function that we are playing it for. This is essentially what lets us modulate so well between going first and second. Going first, if we do get hit with a hand trap, either we can get something to try to extend our plays, set up to play on our opponent's turn with Dreaming Town, or if we can still set up through the hand trap, we can set a Harpy's Featherstorm directly from deck and basically lock out the game. Going second, depending on if we've sided or not, it can grab an evenly matched, it can grab pot cards to draw, it just has so much varying utility based on the other things that we're playing in the deck that it's kind of hard to find a one-to-one replacement for it. That being said, I will make some suggestions. You can play 2 copies of Triple Tactics Talents. It does give you some flexibility in similar situations. You can slot in 2 of the Dark Ruinamors or Lightning Storms that we currently have in the side deck into the main deck, and then just jam additional hand traps in the side deck to fill the space. You could just put Change of Heart in there and double down on DD Crow. You could also triple up on the next card that we're going to talk about, but if you have access to them, I would absolutely suggest Triple Tactics Thrust here. But if you don't be disheartened by that. There are replacements that you can play here. Following that up, we are on double copies of Book of Moon. So this is a little bit of a flex spot, but I think you should probably reserve it for cards that fill the niche that Book of Moon is filling, and that is protecting our plays from going off on our own turn and getting a little bit of offensive use on our opponent's turn if we don't need to use it defensively. So the 2 comparable cards that I've also tried out in this slot are Book of Eclipse and Enemy Controller. I personally, after testing all 3, have really preferred Book of Moon, especially since we are gearing this more towards going first. That's what I want to prioritize as what I need this slot to do. And closing out the spells for the main deck, we are on 1 copy of Harpy's Feather Duster. We just want to clear all that pesky back row out, and pretty much every deck has some sort of searchable back row that we don't want to be dealing with anyway, so might as well main deck one of these bad boys. That does it for the spells. Let's talk about the traps. So our concession to a lost die roll, we're running 2 copies of Evenly Matched. This is a little bit of another flex spot. Again, I've tested double Dark Ruler no more in here. I've tested double Lightning Storm. I've tested 1 Evenly, 1 Dark Ruler no more. And the double Evenly Match just seems to be working the best for me personally, but I would gauge this off of your own local meta and adjust accordingly from there. Next up, 1 copy of Harpy's Featherstorm. Not much more to say about this, but again, Triple Tactics Thrust makes having one of these in the main deck so powerful and so amazingly threatening if your opponent interacts with you, and you can still play through it. And last but not least, 1 copy of Floowandereeze and the Dreaming Town. We search it so naturally in our combo that we almost always have access to this card. Plus, Toucan can recycle it nearly infinitely. That does it for the main deck. Let's talk extra deck. So if this is one of your first times watching one of my Floowandereeze deck profiles, my personal take on the extra deck for Floowandereeze is, yes, 99% of the time we are just banishing it for prosperity, but you should also really view it as a toolbox for super niche situations. All that being said though, make sure every single card in your extra deck is usable and playable. It is a huge rarity that you actually dip into the extra deck, but might as well make sure you're maximizing on the use that any part of your deck has. So I will start this off with what I think is kind of the only non-negotiable inclusion in this extra deck, and that is the double Azaius package consisting of 1 copy of Assembled Nightingale for poking indirectly, 1 copy of Promenade Thrush. I still like this card. It deals with some weird floodgates in a way where you can still go into double Azaius afterwards. 1 copy of Downward Magician. It's just an additional material for Zaius. And the boy himself, double Azaius. Next up, a new addition, and this is one that you could replace with almost anything else really. It is Superstar Slayer Typhon Sky Crisis. I like having this. It's a really good anti-Zaius card, and double Azaius is a card that this deck does sometimes have issues with dealing with. Plus, we have so many means of summoning and playing on our opponent's turn that the restriction of not being able to summon the turn you summon this isn't the worst thing in the world. So I don't necessarily think you need this card, but it is a really nice addition to have in the deck. That does it for the XCs. Let's go into our links. So first off, we are on Relinquished Anima. Just a really good link. 1, it punishes bad board placement, and it could potentially fiend out a negation early if you're going for an access code line. Following that up, we are on 1 copy of Dark the Dark Charmer, 1 copy of Wind the Wind Charmer, and 1 copy of Area the Water Charmer. We can make all of these within the deck. Dark the Dark Charmer is a little bit more difficult, but that Relinquished Anima does bridge that. And from there, we can grab any one of those elements back from our opponent's graveyard in order to go into Selene, Queen of the Master Magicians. Really important to note. Again, Dimension Shifter is a spellcaster for this, so get our D Shifter back, and boom, we go into the boy himself, Access Code Talker. Once again, this really does not come up particularly often, but it's a really cool line to have access to. And if you do make access code using Selene, you will have a 5300 access code, which in addition to an onboard M-Pen's 2700 attack points makes exactly 8000 damage. Pretty cool. Next up, we've got some general utility link monsters. So we're on one copy of Nightmare Phoenix. This is another out to weird floodgates. If you have to make this to clear a floodgate, it's not the best position to be in, but it's good to be aware that you do have access to it. Following that up, we've got a nice out to Baguska replacing Codebreaker Virus Swordsman in Skystriker Ace Azalea. This is actually an out to like almost anything with really the exception of Skill Drain, but I like having it in the extra deck. You could replace this with Codebreaker Virus Swordsman though, because Baguska is another card that is a big issue and Codebreaker can 100% out a Baguska. Following that up, a card that is 110% replaceable in this deck. Do not even worry about it. But we're playing one copy of SP Little Knight. It is just an absurdly powerful card. But once again, you can play Nightmare Cerberus, you can play Recital Starling. There is any number of usable extra deck monsters that you can replace SP Little Knight in this list with. It will not be particularly consequential. And closing out our extra deck, my personal favorite monster in there, Underworld Goddess of the Closed Worlds. We're keeping her around. Towers monsters don't come up particularly often with the exception of X-Pearly Noir, but there is no conceivable way you are getting to Underworld Goddess of the Closed World playing Floowandereeze with X-Pearly Noir on the field, so it's just in there for weird niche rogue matchups, but we've got the space for it, why not play it? Alright, and now let's talk about the side deck. First and foremost, we're on triple copies of Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. We just want to have access to a variety of different stops that we can pull in depending on the matchup. Following that up, we are on triple copies of Droll and Lockbird. Overall for this format, I really think Droll is a solid choice to have. We're not maining it though, as a lot of what loses to Dimension Shifter also loses to Droll. However, if we do need that extra coverage, these can come right in from the side deck to fill that gap. Next up, we're on one copy of DD Crow. Again, I like having a second copy to have access to just to slot in case we want to double up on that, but one in the main deck, one in the side has felt really, really good so far. Double copies of Lightning Storm, just generically strong go second card. Again, this deck does kind of have some issues with back row. We want to get that right out of there. Triple copies of Dark Ruler No More, just a really, really powerful board breaker. Depending on the matchup, we bring these in if we are going second and take advantage of this deck's insane ability to clean up a super simplified game state. Following that up, one copy of Evenly Matched to round out the full playset between the main and the side deck. So this, I've been a little bit back and forth with making this either a second DD Crow in the side deck, bumping us up to 3 available copies total, but you know me and my side decks, if you've watched any of my deck profiles before, I do always have the caveat that I'm constantly working and changing the side decks around a lot. So just had to mention the other things I was considering, but at the moment, yeah, one copy of Evenly Matched right here. And closing it out, we are on 2 additional copies of Harpy's Featherstorm when you want to really, really go first and just get as much access to this card as humanly possible. Alright, so that does it for the list. I know it's been a while since I've talked about Floowandereeze on this channel, but I've really been testing this list a lot, having a lot of fun and having a lot of success with it, so I felt it was a good time to share it with all of y'all. Again, anything where I think that there could be alternate options or budget options I tried to mention, but if you have additional questions or want to know my opinion on different cards that you could be trying to play in here, absolutely drop a comment and let me know, and I will try to answer it as best I can. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to drop it a like and subscribe to the channel for even more, and I will catch you all later.